June 4th, 1943, Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia. The morning air carried the smell of salt and diesel. 2,500 German prisoners of war stood motionless on the dock, staring at cranes moving like metallic insects above a harbor that seemed endless. For many, this was the first clear look at the United States, the nation their leaders had described as weak, chaotic, racially degenerate. What they saw, instead, defied everything the Reich had taught them. Through the haze, machines dwarfed men. Electric cranes unloaded Liberty ships with a rhythm more precise than any German drill. African American and white dock workers worked side by side, shouting directions drowned by jazz music from a nearby radio. Women in coveralls drove forklifts, hair tied beneath bright scarves. Children sold newspapers outside the base gates. To German eyes, trained on militarized order, it looked like madness. And yet, the chaos functioned perfectly. Unoffizier Hermann Butcher gripped the railing as he descended the gangplank. 14 days across the Atlantic had not prepared him for this. Die Spinnen, die Amerikaner, he muttered to his comrade. The Americans are insane. Later, in his memoir Behind Barbed Wire, 1952, he would write that the first blow to Nazi certainty came not from defeat, but from normalcy. They acted as if the war were somewhere else. They smiled. We were the ones staring. The prisoners marched in columns across a base that covered more than 4,000 acres, its docks stretching beyond sight. In one morning, Norfolk handled more cargo than Hamburg managed in a week. Brass bands played Swing for a War Bond rally within earshot of captured enemies. Vendors sold coffee and donuts outside a restricted zone. Civilians moved freely among armed guards. Every visible detail contradicted German logic, which dictated that total war required total control. Official records show that June 4th was only the beginning. By war's end, more than 425,000 German POWs would pass through American soil. But that first contingent from Rommel's Africa Corps, sunburned, hollow-eyed veterans of North Africa, would become the test case of an experiment in democracy under conditions of total victory. What they saw, touched, and tasted in the following months would dismantle an ideology more effectively than any Allied pamphlet. The processing line began inside a warehouse converted into a reception hall. American officers greeted the prisoners in fluent German, reading out sections of the Geneva Convention. They asked about dietary restrictions, medical conditions, and religion. Jewish American sergeants distributed Red Cross packages to Wehrmacht officers who had spent years hearing that Jews were subhuman. Some laughed nervously, expecting mockery. It never came. Each man received a numbered tag, a physical examination, and a hot meal: beef stew, white bread, coffee with sugar. To most, it was the first meat they had tasted in weeks. Swiss Inspector Guy Matron recorded in his July 1943 report, "Treatment of German POWs equals or exceeds that of American troops. Prisoners expressed disbelief at equality of rations." One sergeant reportedly whispered, "If this is captivity, then Germany has already lost." For American personnel, this was routine. For the prisoners, it was cognitive rupture. They had entered a world where industrial power expressed itself not in oppression, but in abundance. The Americans could afford generosity because their factories never slept, their farms never starved, their machines never stopped. To men raised on scarcity, such waste felt supernatural. That night, as the train prepared to carry them inland toward Texas and Oklahoma, Butcher watched lights stretching across the horizon, city after city glowing unblacked, unrestricted. In Germany, total darkness had ruled the night since 1940. Here, electricity burned without fear. They waste light like we waste lives, he wrote. The prisoners did not yet know that what awaited them would be stranger still, a nation fighting the largest war in history, while behaving as if victory were already certain. They would learn that democracy could defeat dictatorship not by imitating it, but by ignoring its rules. How could such disorder produce triumph? And how could mercy become a weapon stronger than fear? Before those men stepped onto American soil, their understanding of war had been built on arithmetic. Germany, they believed, had mastered that equation. A nation of 80 million, producing weapons with mathematical precision, conquering half of Europe in less than 2 years. The Wehrmacht's efficiency was legend. Its victories seemed to prove that discipline, not democracy, was the highest form of organization. Between 1939 and 1942, German industry functioned as a weaponized machine. Every bolt and bullet had a purpose, every worker a rank. The Reich had built 100,000 aircraft, 25,000 tanks, 20 million rifles, and consumed 50 million tons of coal annually. Numbers that appeared invincible until the curve flattened. By 1943, the Allies' production outpaced Germany 5-1. What the prisoners could not yet comprehend was that America had converted chaos into capacity. The Third Reich's ideology had mistaken control for strength. Factories ran on fear. Innovation required permission. In contrast, American industry ran on competition and improvisation. The free market that Nazi economists mocked as inefficient became the engine that buried them. Henry Kaiser's shipyards built Liberty ships in under 5 days. Boeing rolled out a new B-17 every 63 minutes. In 1 year, Ford's Willow Run factory produced more aircraft than Germany's entire pre-war air force. Yet these figures were invisible to the front-line soldiers captured in North Africa. Their propaganda spoke of a decadent America, unemployed, racially divided, ruled by Jews and capitalists. Films shown to the Africa Corps depicted New York slums and rural poverty, claiming that the United States survived only by exploiting others. When those same men arrived in Virginia and saw African American and white workers operating side by side under floodlights, when they heard jazz from radios louder than orders, the contradiction struck deeper than defeat. Nazi racial doctrine taught that racial mixture led to decay. But in the docks of Norfolk, racial mixture built the world's largest navy. America's diversity, its very disorder, had become a strategic asset. That realization began eroding faith in the mathematics of the Reich. At home, Germany's total war had turned civilians into soldiers of production. Women were mobilized reluctantly, forced into munitions factories only after Stalingrad. In America, women had entered the workforce voluntarily before the first shot was fired. By 1943, 6 million of them worked in war industries. To German soldiers raised in patriarchal obedience, a woman directing men was a symbol of collapse. To Americans, it was efficiency. Even religion, long exploited by Nazi propaganda, carried its own quiet message of contradiction. At Norfolk, chaplains, Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish, served side by side. For the first time, captured Germans witnessed cooperation among faiths that at home were instruments of division. They pray to the same God in different ways, one POW wrote. In Germany, we were told this was a weakness. Here, it feels like strength. But the real shock would come not from sermons or speeches, but from observation. American power wasn't hidden behind parade grounds or propaganda films. It was everywhere, casual and unapologetic. The base cafeteria served real coffee. The guard towers used electric light. The trucks idled with engines running because fuel was cheap and endless. In Germany, scarcity was a virtue. Hitler youth were taught to save crumbs of bread, to mend uniforms until they disintegrated, to see waste as treason. The American habit of abundance looked obscene at first. It wasn't ideology. It was output. The prisoners had walked into a civilization so productive it didn't need to measure victory in territory. It measured in tonnage, horsepower, kilowatts. By 1943, the United States produced 96,000 aircraft annually, 28,000 tanks, and 8 million tons of shipping. Every 24 hours, its factories consumed more steel than Germany could mine in a week. For every German worker, there were 10 Americans supported by machines that never tired. In Berlin, propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels dismissed these statistics as exaggeration, claiming American quality was poor and its soldiers soft. He told his people that democracy could never sustain discipline. Yet the men in Norfolk saw discipline without fear. Workers laughing as they labored, soldiers smiling at civilians, a war machine powered by voluntary effort. It wasn't just numbers that doomed Germany. It was philosophy. A system that valued obedience over imagination could not compete with one that rewarded problem-solving. The Allied advantage was not merely industrial, it was conceptual. Still, in June 1943, the captured soldiers did not yet understand the scale of the imbalance. They believed their imprisonment temporary, their defeat reversible. They could not imagine that this brief exposure to their enemy's abundance would reshape how they thought, prayed, and remembered. When their train departed Norfolk that evening, headlights stretched into infinity across the American countryside. Cities glowed without blackout curtains. Factories worked through the night. Trains ran on precise schedules without soldiers guarding the tracks. For men raised under total surveillance, this freedom was incomprehensible. They had been told that democracy was chaos. What they saw was order emerging from liberty, wealth born of waste, mercy born of confidence. Could a society so undisciplined truly sustain the greatest war in history? And if so, what did that say about everything Germany believed? July 1943, somewhere between Virginia and Texas. The train windows framed a world that should not exist. Town after town glowed under electric light at midnight. Street lamps burned in every direction. Gas stations stayed open. Factories hummed through the dark. To the captured soldiers of the Africa Corps, it looked like fantasy drawn by an engineer with no sense of limitation. Obergefreiter Hans Meyer, a mechanic from Hamburg, wrote later that the first true collapse of Nazi faith began not in defeat, but in observation. They waste energy like we waste men, he recorded in his notebook. Each small town has more power than our capital. Every few hours, the trains stopped to take on water and coal. In Germany, that process consumed 2 hours and half a dozen men. Here, American rail workers, cigarettes in mouths, sleeves rolled up, did it in 30 minutes. Automated loaders fed coal directly into hoppers. Electric pumps refilled tanks. The guards didn't bark orders. They drank coffee, laughed, and waited. The prisoners expected resentment or curiosity. Instead, civilians ignored them. A group of schoolchildren waved at the windows. One woman handed fruit to a sergeant through an open door. No speeches, no hatred, just routine generosity. To men who had been taught that Americans feared and despised them, such indifference was more unsettling than hostility. At Roanoke, Virginia, the prisoners were ordered out for exercise. They stepped into a rail yard brighter than any street in wartime Europe. The smell of gasoline and hot steel filled the air. One of the guards, a former factory foreman from Detroit, explained that this yard alone moved more freight in a day than Germany's entire southern network. The claim sounded absurd until the next train thundered by, 100 cars long carrying nothing but vehicles. Lieutenant Friedrich Radke, who had commanded a transport platoon in Tunisia, tried to calculate the logistics. The Americans were moving automobiles by the thousands, while Germany rationed tires. Every detail challenged his sense of military logic. Power here was casual, not ceremonial. Authority came from function, not rank. The trains crossed into Tennessee and Kentucky. Through the windows, the landscape changed from steel to farmland. But the astonishment continued. Fields stretched beyond the horizon, each dotted with machines the prisoners had only seen in magazines. Tractors, harvesters, combines. Electricity reached even the smallest barns. In Germany, only 20% of farms had been electrified before the war. Here, every farmhouse had lights. When they passed the aluminum plant at Alcoa, Tennessee, the night sky glowed orange. The guards explained that the facility produced metal for aircraft fuselages 24 hours a day. The prisoners counted the chimneys, 32 in sight, and saw train cars loaded with shining ingots. Later, they learned that this single plant consumed more power than all of Munich. One prisoner, Unteroffizier Wilhelm Hoffmann, a former engineer for IG Farben, stared at the complex in silence. In his later diary, he wrote, "It was not propaganda. It was geometry. The scale itself was the argument." By the third day, disbelief turned to fatigue. The landscapes blurred, factory, field, city, river, until abundance became monotony. But monotony had meaning. In Germany, the train from Hamburg to Munich crossed hundreds of kilometers of blackouts, craters, and scarcity. In America, the rhythm never broke. Production was not a campaign. It was a condition. When the train entered Texas, the prisoners felt heat radiate through the steel walls. Out the windows, they saw ranches larger than German provinces. Cattle herds moved like dark tides under the sun. Oil pumps dotted the horizon, each moving in slow mechanical rhythm. To the guards, it was ordinary. To the Germans, it was incomprehensible wealth. At a brief stop near Dallas, a civilian worker offered the prisoners Coca-Cola bottles from a crate. Some accepted cautiously, unsure if it was a trick. The taste, a mixture of sweetness and cold, made them laugh for the first time since capture. "Even their water is luxurious," one said. On the evening of July 8th, the train slowed near the small town of Hearne, Texas. The sun hung low, staining the sky red behind a grid of telephone poles. Beyond the station stood barracks surrounded by barbed wire, floodlights, and a flag that fluttered lazily in the heat. The camp was new, built in 4 months by the Army Corps of Engineers to house nearly 5,000 prisoners. As the prisoners stepped down, they noticed the smell of cut grass, the hum of generators, the faint music of a distant radio. It was nothing like the prison camps of Europe. No mud, no shouting, no guard dogs. Rows of wooden buildings lined paved paths. Each barrack had windows, electric bulbs, even screened doors to keep out insects. A German officer muttered, "This is not a camp, this is a small town." He wasn't wrong. The camp's infrastructure mirrored America itself, organized, efficient, overbuilt. Inside the wire, Lieutenant Colonel Cecil Stiles, the camp commander, greeted the new arrivals in fluent German. "You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention," he said evenly. "You will work, you will learn, and you will live." Some prisoners smirked, convinced it was theater. Others simply nodded. None of them yet understood that the real education had already begun. The lessons were written not in words, but in electricity, machinery, and abundance. As floodlights flickered on above the camp that night, one prisoner whispered to another, "If they can waste this much power on us, how much do they have for themselves?" The answer, they would discover, was infinite, an infinity that would soon rewrite everything they believed about power, race, and civilization. What happens when men raised in tyranny discover that their enemy's freedom is more disciplined than their own obedience? August 1943, Camp Hearn, Texas. The first night passed in silence, broken only by cicadas and distant trains. When morning came, the prisoners awoke to something almost insulting: comfort. Sunlight filtered through clean windows. The barracks smelled of pine and soap. There were mattresses, sheets, electric fans. Hot water ran from the taps. Each man received a metal tray filled with eggs, bread, butter, and coffee served with milk. To soldiers accustomed to rations of black bread and ersatz coffee, it felt like parody. Obergefreiter Rudolf Klein, who had fought at El Alamein, asked the interpreter if this meal was a special occasion. The American sergeant laughed. "Same breakfast every day," Klein wrote later. That was the moment I understood we had lost the war. A nation that feeds its prisoners better than we feed our soldiers cannot be defeated. The first inspection came 2 days later. Swiss Red Cross officials recorded details that seemed impossible, even to neutral eyes: electric lighting in all quarters, infirmary with X-ray machines, surgical suites, and sterilizers, all standard. The hospital stocked penicillin, still scarce in Europe. Every prisoner received medical treatment identical to that of American troops. In their diaries, captured German doctors admitted professional envy. The camp's layout mirrored American pragmatism. Order without rigidity. Barracks lined in perfect rows, separated by gravel paths and lawns trimmed weekly by POW work details. Each compound held a canteen, library, and recreation hall. Even the barbed wire seemed unnecessary. Escape into a country this vast was futile. The guards behaved less like conquerors than administrators. The first work assignments came quickly. Prisoners volunteered for labor in nearby farms and factories. Under the Geneva Convention, they were paid 80 cents per day in canteen coupons, equal to the pay of a U.S. private. They spent it on cigarettes, chocolate, soap, and paper. Some bought harmonicas, others sketchbooks. Commerce existed inside captivity. At the King Ranch near Kingsville, German laborers confronted American agriculture. The scale broke their imagination. 825,000 acres of land, more than the size of the German Saarland. Tractors roamed like tanks. Aircraft circled overhead to spot cattle. The foreman, Richard Kleberg Jr., treated the Germans as hired help, not enemies. His order of the day was simple: work steady, eat well. They learned that one American combine harvester could do the work of 50 men. Electricity powered the gins, not human labor. Trucks replaced oxen, diesel replaced muscle. Each farm they visited looked like a small factory. Even in the countryside, power lines traced the horizon. 90% of Texas farms had electricity by 1943. In Germany, most still relied on kerosene. Unteroffizier Helmut Vogel, once proud of his technical training, watched a 16-year-old American boy operate a tractor worth more than his father's house. He worked with one hand, chewing gum and listening to music, Vogel recalled. He controlled more horsepower than an entire platoon. This casual mastery of machines shattered the myth of primitive America. Nazi propaganda had portrayed U.S. workers as lazy, dependent on immigrants and Negro labor. Yet here, Negroes and whites worked side by side. Productivity came not from racial hierarchy, but from mechanization and cooperation. It was the inversion of everything Germany believed about efficiency. By September, the prisoners had adjusted to the rhythm of camp life. They attended church services, played soccer on open fields, and wrote censored letters home. But beneath the routine, something irreversible was happening. Observation had become education. In Europe, technology served ideology. In America, ideology served technology. The difference was decisive. American machines existed to make life easier. German machines existed to make war harder. Here, a refrigerator preserved milk. There, a furnace melted steel. The same science, opposite purpose. During an inspection of the camp's power station, a German engineer asked the American technician how many prisoners worked there. The answer, none. It was fully automated. The engineer noted quietly, "In Germany, this would require 30 men." The American replied, "That's why you lost." For the first time, even hardened officers stopped speaking of victory. Pride began to fracture under the weight of reality. The United States had turned abundance into strategy. Logistics had become a moral force. By October, reports from the War Department's Special Projects Division noted a measurable decline in Nazi sentiment. The cause wasn't propaganda, but exposure. Seeing was believing, and belief was collapsing. Each evening, the camp glowed under electric lights visible for kilometers. To German minds trained on blackout discipline, this illumination was defiance, a declaration that safety no longer required darkness. Power, literal and symbolic, belonged to those who could afford to shine. That winter, when American guards decorated the camp with Christmas lights, the spectacle felt like conquest in another form. It wasn't the soldier that triumphed, but the system that could illuminate captivity without fear. How could a nation so careless with its luxuries remain so precise in its victories? And what kind of empire was built on comfort instead of conquest? December 1943, Camp Hearn, Texas. The first Christmas in captivity arrived not with punishment, but celebration. The entire town of Hearn, population barely 2,000, had prepared for their enemy's holiday. The local newspaper listed the donations: cigarettes from the American Legion, cakes from the Women's Club, handmade cards from school children. Even the town's churches sent choirs to perform German carols. Silent Night echoed through the wire that December evening, sung in 2 languages. For the prisoners, it was unbearable. They had been told that Americans were materialists without faith, a nation of merchants incapable of spiritual depth. Yet here, American mothers whose sons were fighting in Italy baked gifts for captured Germans. Why? No one could explain it. The meal itself belonged to another world. Turkey, ham, candied sweet potatoes, pies, ice cream, even wine for officers. Quartermaster records later showed a ration of 5,000 calories per man that night. In Germany, civilians survived on less than 200. The guards laughed, insisting this was a normal Christmas dinner. It was generosity without calculation, and that made it devastating. Obergefreiter Hermann Bercher, once an ardent Nazi, wrote, "They treated us not as enemies, but as men. Their kindness was not weakness, it was certainty. Only those sure of victory can afford mercy." He was not alone. Camp psychologists monitoring morale noted a sharp shift. Fanatics grew quiet. Indifference replaced defiance. The American experiment in re-education was succeeding, not through words, but through contradiction. Meanwhile, outside the wire, the prisoners witnessed another phenomenon: the collapse of old doctrines about war itself. The United States had turned every civilian activity into military efficiency without militarizing its people. There were no uniforms in factories, no parades in fields, yet production multiplied daily. At the nearby Alcoa aluminum plant in Rockdale, prisoners assigned to collect scrap watched as women and older men ran conveyor belts, welding lines and furnaces. Machines did most of the work. Humans simply kept them fed. The foreman, a woman in her 30s, supervised 200 laborers. She carried a clipboard instead of a whip. Unteroffizier Kurt Feld, who had trained mechanics for the Luftwaffe, studied the system in disbelief. She commanded with competence, not terror, he told a guard. In Germany, such authority for a woman would be impossible. The guard replied, "That's why she gets things done." Doctrine, the Germans realized, had become their cage. Their officers preached sacrifice and blood. The Americans preached improvement and results. When mistakes happened, Americans fixed them, not punished them. That difference, mercy applied to machinery, was a tactical revolution. The Special Projects Division, America's secret re-education arm, documented the shift with precision. By late 1943, 60% of Camp Hearn's prisoners participated voluntarily in English lessons or technical courses. Professors from Sam Houston State Teachers College traveled monthly to teach economics, mathematics, and history. The goal was not indoctrination, it was exposure. Show them how a democracy functions, then let them decide. For the prisoners, the exposure was lethal to ideology. They read banned German authors, Thomas Mann and Erich Maria Remarque, books that would have meant prison back home. They discussed politics without fear. They argued about jazz. The camp newspaper, Der Spiegel, years before its famous namesake in Germany, shifted tone from rigid nationalism to cautious curiosity. One American officer wrote in his report, "The most effective propaganda is the sight of normal life." He was right. Every truck that arrived on time, every light that stayed on, every shop filled with goods was a lecture in civilization. In January 1944, a delegation of prisoners was sent to work at the Lone Star Steel Plant in Dangerfield. The scale stunned even former engineers. The blast furnaces consumed enough coal daily to power the entire Ruhr before the bombings. Charts on factory walls compared output by shift. Workers competed for bonuses. Managers listened to their suggestions. In Germany, questioning a superior was insubordination. Here, it was efficiency. Hauptmann Werner Schultz, a career officer, confessed privately, "They win wars by conversation." The tactical revolution extended beyond machines. In American society, freedom had become an instrument of order. Criticism wasn't treason, it was maintenance. Radio comedians mocked generals. Newspapers attacked government policy. Yet production never faltered. Democracy was functioning as a weapon. When the prisoners discussed it, some refused to believe it could last. "It is illusion," said one colonel. "They are rich now. When hardship comes, they will tear each other apart." But hardship never came. Factories kept running, wages kept rising, and ships kept sailing. By spring, the contrast between the old German doctrine of sacrifice and the new American doctrine of abundance was undeniable. The Reich demanded blood for progress. America demanded improvement. One system consumed men, the other multiplied them. A guard summarized it in plain English to a puzzled prisoner. "You Germans fight wars with people. We fight them with systems." For the prisoners, that sentence explained everything they had seen since Norfolk. It wasn't superior soldiers or strategy. It was an industrial philosophy. The realization carried moral weight. How could a dictatorship claiming racial perfection lose to a democracy of contradictions, black and white, rich and poor, believer and skeptic, working together without terror? The answer began to form in their minds as they looked around the camp at night, lights glowing over barbed wire. Unity born of freedom, not fear. If chaos could produce this order, what would happen when this system rebuilt the world instead of conquering it? Spring 1944, Camp Hearn, Texas. The prisoners had stopped counting the days. Seasons replaced calendars. Yet each new work detail, each field trip beyond the wire, widened the same discovery. Germany had built an army. America had built a civilization. The difference showed itself most brutally in machines. At the Rockdale aluminum plant, the prisoners watched molten metal pouring through automated channels, controlled by remote valves. In Germany, that process required 20 men, each with protective aprons and shovels. Here, one worker monitored gauges behind glass while sipping coffee. "He smokes while working," whispered Obergefreiter Vogel. In Germany, smoke would cost your life. Everywhere they went, the pattern repeated. Electricity replaced labor. Instruments replaced supervision. Knowledge replaced punishment. In April, prisoners assigned to the Lone Star Steel plant witnessed an industrial miracle that erased all doubt. The factory produced 10,000 tons of steel daily, more than the entire Ruhr Valley managed monthly under Allied bombing. The Germans measured furnace output in kilograms per worker. The Americans measured it in efficiency per shift. "Each man here," one POW noted, "produces more in an hour than we did in a week. They call this capitalism. I call it sorcery." The numbers were irrefutable. By 1944, the United States generated 63% of all war materials produced by the Allies, twice the output of Germany, Japan, and Italy combined. Its factories manufactured one airplane every 5 minutes, one tank every 10, and one rifle every 30 seconds. The prisoners read these figures in American newspapers, distributed freely in camp. At first they laughed. Then they saw them confirmed with their own eyes. Convoys of trucks arriving daily, trains stretching beyond sight, warehouses overflowing. At the Herne Camp Hospital, another revelation unfolded. Medical personnel worked alongside captured German doctors, sharing equipment that didn't exist even in Berlin. The Americans treated pneumonia with penicillin, still unknown to most of the world. They used anesthesia machines, sterilizers, and diagnostic X-rays. No shortages, no rationing. Oberstabsarzt Friedrich Bauer, chief surgeon of the 164th Light Division, wrote later, "They used penicillin on prisoners with minor infections. In the Reich, generals died for lack of it. That was when I understood technology as morality." Beyond medicine, the prisoners encountered America's invisible weapon, communication. Every worksite, from farm to factory, operated with radios. Foremen coordinated shipments by telephone across hundreds of kilometers. Truck convoys received updates from dispatchers through loudspeakers and coded messages. In Germany, radio served propaganda. In America, it served logistics. The result was precision without command. An engineer among the prisoners, Wilhelm Hoffmann, once responsible for supply lines in North Africa, studied the system during a detail to the Missouri-Kansas-Texas railway yard. "Their trains run without military supervision," he wrote. "No officers, no salutes, yet every car arrives on time. We needed punishment to create order. They use information." The efficiency extended to the skies. Prisoners could see military aircraft passing overhead in endless streams, training flights, cargo runs, ferry missions. Each one represented a network of fuel, maintenance, and spare parts beyond comprehension. By 1944, the United States had trained over 193,000 pilots and built more than 120,000 aircraft. Germany could barely replace its losses. The technology gap widened daily. It wasn't just quantity, it was sustainability. American production lines could shift models overnight. When the P-47 Thunderbolt required new engine mounts, Ford engineers retooled in 72 hours. In the Reich, such changes demanded permission, signatures, and weeks of delay. The prisoners began to understand that technology wasn't merely invention, it was organization. Systems, not slogans, built empires. At a Texas cotton gin, one guard demonstrated an electric motor used to power a press. "You plug it in, it works," he said casually. A German prisoner, trained in mechanical engineering, asked where the spare parts came from. The guard shrugged. "From somewhere up north, I guess." That ignorance, of abundance so vast it didn't require awareness, was the ultimate humiliation. Propaganda back home had promised German supremacy in science. And indeed, the Reich had pioneered jet engines, rockets, and advanced optics. But these were weapons of desperation, brilliance without mass production. America's genius was opposite: average technology, infinite scale. Statistics from the War Production Board made the truth undeniable. The U.S. produced 2,710 Liberty ships between 1941 and 1945, more than the entire Japanese merchant fleet. It built 86,000 tanks, 41 billion rounds of ammunition, and distributed 14 million tons of food overseas. In the same years, Germany's rail system collapsed under bombing, and its synthetic fuel plants met only 30% of demand. One American colonel summarized the situation during a Red Cross inspection. "They have scientists. We have engineers." By mid-1944, even the most devoted Nazis in Camp Herne struggled to explain the contradiction. How could a nation so chaotic, so undisciplined, achieve such coherence? The answer, they began to suspect, was trust. American systems relied on workers thinking for themselves. In Germany, thought required permission. A captured Luftwaffe officer confessed quietly to a camp interpreter, "We are sending children to fight professionals." The phrase spread through the barracks like a funeral toll. That summer, as news of Normandy reached Texas, the magnitude of the technological divide became visible even from captivity. Newspapers reported 6,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, and 150,000 men landing in a single day. The prisoners did the math. Such an operation required 15 million tons of supplies, millions of engines, billions of bullets, all coordinated across an ocean. No tyranny on earth could match that organization born of freedom. Each headline, each photograph, each rumor confirmed the same truth. America's true weapon was the machine of production itself. And yet the prisoners couldn't stop asking the same question each night as they watched the floodlights hum overhead. If the enemy's strength was no longer human but systemic, what chance did any ideology have against arithmetic? Summer 1944, Camp Herne, Texas. News traveled slowly into captivity, but even silence carried rumors. In June, guards pinned a newspaper clipping to the camp bulletin board. "Allied forces land in France." Below it, a map dotted with names unfamiliar to most: Normandy, Omaha, Utah. The prisoners gathered around the notice in disbelief. The figures were printed clearly: 6,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, 150,000 men in one day. The numbers didn't read like war. They read like manufacturing output, a supply chain disguised as an invasion. Hauptmann Werner Schulz whispered, "If this is true, it means they can move entire cities." Nobody argued. They had seen enough of America to know the statement wasn't exaggeration. For years, the Wehrmacht had told itself that the Atlantic Wall was impregnable, but in one day, the sea itself seemed to surrender. The American logistical system, the same invisible machine that had fed, clothed, and mechanized their prison guards, had now bridged an ocean. That morning, the camp's German-language newspaper, monitored and censored by U.S. officials, published a translation of General Eisenhower's message: "We will accept nothing less than full victory." It wasn't arrogance, it was accounting. Victory for the United States had become a matter of production rate versus destruction rate. By July, new headlines arrived daily. Cherbourg captured. Calm falls. Paris liberated. The prisoners tracked the advance on maps tacked to their barracks walls. Each arrow westward represented an impossible quantity of steel, fuel, and coordination. One man calculated that the Allies consumed more gasoline in a week than Germany refined in a month. The camp's library carried American newspapers: the Chicago Tribune, the Dallas Morning News, the New York Times. Even filtered through censorship, the statistics were undeniable. The United States was producing more ammunition each month than Germany had stockpiled in 5 years. Ford's Willow Run plant alone manufactured 20,000 B-24 bombers by 1944. Every 63 minutes, a new aircraft rolled off its assembly line. For the prisoners, it was a form of psychological bombardment. Propaganda could be dismissed, arithmetic could not. Then came the news from the east. The Red Army had crossed the Vistula. From both directions, the Reich was shrinking into a statistical impossibility. Too few tanks, too little fuel, too many fronts. In August, the War Department's Special Projects Division recorded a new phenomenon among the POW population: ideological silence. The Nazi faithful no longer held debates. The camp loudspeakers played jazz without protest. Letters home carried neutral language. Words like honor and destiny disappeared, replaced by future and after. The strategic disaster wasn't only military, it was cognitive. The Germans had believed in the power of discipline. The Americans proved the power of systems. Even inside the wire, the evidence surrounded them. Food never ran out. Laundry returned clean every week. Mail arrived on schedule. Every light bulb worked. These small consistencies formed an argument larger than any battlefield. A prisoner named Obergefreiter Hans Meyer wrote to his wife, "They plan everything, yet they seem unplanned. They are free, but they obey rules without fear. Perhaps that is their secret. They have made freedom efficient." By September, they began to hear of Allied advances into Germany itself. Aachen fallen, Cologne burning, Dresden yet untouched. But still the war continued, fueled by denial. During mealtimes, the Guard spoke openly about Europe's destruction. "You'll go home soon," one said. "Nothing left to fight for." The prisoners didn't reply. They had no vocabulary left for collapse. At the same time, the Americans inside the camp carried themselves as though the war were already over. They read newspapers about baseball, not battles. They joked about gasoline rationing. The difference was unbearable. For the prisoners, war remained a question of survival. For the Americans, it was logistics, an equation already solved. The Red Cross reports confirmed what they could feel in the air. Germany's industrial production had fallen below 40% of 1940 levels. Allied bombing had erased synthetic fuel plants, ball-bearing factories, and railway networks. The Reich's total aircraft output for the year barely matched 1 month of American production. The prisoners compared figures like priests reading scripture. The verdict was inescapable. Unteroffizier Vogel summarized it in his diary. "We lost the war when we made engineers salute politicians." Yet the most devastating truth was moral. The Americans, who bombed German cities by night, still treated their prisoners with decency by day. They handed out cigarettes, organized music nights, allowed Red Cross parcels. It was not hypocrisy. It was hierarchy of confidence. The victors could afford kindness. The defeated could only dream of vengeance. In October, a rumor spread through the camp that Field Marshal Rommel was dead. Suicide, they said. The guards confirmed it days later with clipped respect. Even the fanatics lowered their heads. The symbol of chivalry and modern war had died by his own hand. For the prisoners, it felt like the final ledger entry. That same week, the camp radio played a news bulletin about the liberation of Paris. The announcer's tone was calm, almost bureaucratic. No celebration, no triumph, just another milestone. The Americans didn't gloat because they didn't need to. Their victory had become procedural. As winter approached, the POWs understood what their generals never had. War was no longer decided by courage or cunning, but by throughput. How much steel, oil, and manpower a nation could process in a given hour. Germany's romantic war of heroes had been replaced by an industrial war of accountants, and the accountants were winning. When snow fell across the Texas fields that December, the men inside the wire felt the distance between themselves and their homeland stretch into infinity. They were living inside the engine that had crushed them, a nation that produced victory as naturally as it produced light and heat. Each night, as they watched the camp glow under electric lamps, while letters from home spoke of cities turned to ash, one thought returned again and again. If mercy and efficiency could coexist here, what would replace the world we had built on fear? March 1945. Camp Hearn, Texas. The radios inside the recreation hall crackled with voices that no longer lied. The war was ending. Cologne had fallen. Berlin was surrounded. The Reich, once destined to last 1,000 years, was dying in less than 12. By then, the German prisoners no longer argued about who was to blame. They simply listened to news bulletins, to American laughter outside, to the quiet hum of the lights above their heads. The electricity never failed. It had become the soundtrack of defeat. At the same hour each day, freight trains passed the camp carrying steel, fuel, and munitions toward the ports. Even in Peace's shadow, the American engine ran full throttle. It was as if the nation itself didn't know how to stop producing. Hauptmann Schultz, who once commanded a panzer company, stood near the fence and watched a convoy of trucks moving along the road beyond the camp. "Every truck has tires," he said softly. "We couldn't even replace ours in Africa." The guard beside him nodded. "Here, we replaced the trucks." The prisoners had come to measure superiority not by victories, but by indifference to failure. America's abundance absorbed mistakes the way an ocean absorbs rain. By 1945, the War Department's own reports listed production totals that no enemy could comprehend. The United States had built 297,000 aircraft, 88,000 tanks, and 2.5 million military trucks. It had shipped 50 billion rounds of ammunition and enough fuel to circle the globe every week. Its Navy, 600-700 vessels, now commanded both oceans simultaneously. The men at Camp Hearn saw none of it directly, but they lived inside its consequences. Their food remained plentiful, their clothes clean, their guards unafraid. Even as German civilians starved under blockade, the prisoners in Texas gained weight. A visiting Red Cross inspector, Emil Sandstrom, wrote in his report, "These camps demonstrate not vengeance, but civilization. The Americans are teaching through example." In April, the guards gathered the prisoners in the mess hall to hear President Roosevelt's death announced on the radio. The camp fell silent. Many Germans expected chaos, a crisis of command. Instead, by nightfall, the new president, Harry S. Truman, had taken the oath of office, and production continued without pause. The machine of democracy didn't need a single man to keep moving. For the prisoners, that stability was the final revelation. Dictatorships promised strength, but collapsed when their leaders died. Democracies appeared fragile, yet endured beyond any individual. The Americans didn't worship power, they maintained it. A week later, the guards played recordings of the German surrender at Remagen. No celebration, just a broadcast. Allied forces had crossed the Rhine using portable bridges built in days. The precision was mechanical, not emotional. The same engineers who paved highways at home had paved the path to victory abroad. Inside the barracks, men spoke openly of the future for the first time. "When we return," one said, "we must rebuild the way they build, quietly, endlessly." Another replied, "If we return." The final shock came not from power, but from mercy. After the surrender, food shipments to Germany resumed under Allied control. American newspapers announced a new policy: reconstruction, not revenge. The prisoners stared at the headlines in disbelief. The victors will feed the defeated. Obergefreiter Hermann Burger, whose faith in the Reich had crumbled the previous Christmas, summed it up in his diary. They have conquered us with production, and now they conquer us with pity. The Guards explained the coming program, the Marshall Plan's earliest drafts, though the name did not yet exist. The United States would rebuild Europe, including Germany. Factories would rise again, funded by the same system that had destroyed them. It was the ultimate act of dominance, to restore one's enemy faster than he could rebuild himself. But it was also something else, proof that power and morality need not be opposites. Each night that spring, as the Texas air turned warm, the prisoners gathered outside to watch the floodlights fade at dawn. Beyond the wire, the landscape stretched endlessly, quiet and fertile. The war that had devoured millions ended here in stillness. They had entered captivity believing they were the soldiers of a superior civilization. They would leave knowing they had lived inside the civilization that had already replaced theirs. One question lingered in the silence after the radio broadcasts, a question that no ideology could answer. If a nation could win by building instead of destroying, what kind of wars would humanity fight next? Summer 1945. Camp Hearn, Texas. The barbed wire still stood, but its purpose had vanished. The war was over. Germany had surrendered unconditionally on May 8th. In the heat of a Texas summer, the victors treated their prisoners not as enemies, but as the first citizens of a world that would need rebuilding. The camp loudspeaker played news of the atomic bomb, of Japan's collapse, of peace treaties. But the prisoners heard something deeper beneath the announcements, the sound of an age ending. The century of ideology had yielded to the century of industry. Inside the wire, everything changed quietly. American officers stopped calling them enemy aliens and began calling them men to be returned home. Classes in English, mathematics, and agriculture expanded. Prisoners who once built weapons now studied soil chemistry and civic administration. The war that had begun with hatred was ending with education. Hauptmann Schultz, who had watched convoys rolling past the fence for 2 years, wrote in his final letter before repatriation, "We came here to learn the limits of defeat. Instead, we learned the limits of control. The Americans do not command. They coordinate. Their authority is mechanical, not moral, and therefore unbreakable." It was an observation echoed across the camps. At Hearn, as in hundreds of other compounds scattered across America, prisoners spent their final months repairing roads, tending fields, and studying democracy. They were paid, thanked, and even photographed for local newspapers. Some were invited to church dinners. Local families wrote farewell letters. To the men who had marched through conquered Europe, this reversal felt impossible. They had invaded nations and left ruins. America had captured them and left memories. When the first repatriation trains departed in late 1945, many prisoners wept, not for homecoming, but for departure. Home meant rubble, rationing, and hunger. America meant light, food, and functioning order. The guards shook hands with their captives. Some exchanged addresses. One guard told his departing prisoner, "Write to me when your country has lights again." Back in Germany, the returnees carried something invisible: knowledge. They had seen industrial democracy, mechanized mercy, efficiency without brutality. They had witnessed women managing factories, minorities commanding respect, citizens criticizing their government without fear. The lessons were more potent than punishment. Within a decade, those same former prisoners would become mayors, engineers, teachers and politicians in a new republic rising from ruin. They rebuilt their nation, not in the image of the Reich, but in the memory of Camp Herne. Historians later called them the quiet missionaries of democracy. Obergefreiter Hermann Berker emigrated to the United States in 1953, becoming a mechanical engineer for General Motors. His memoir closed with a single line: "I arrived as a soldier of empire and became a servant of systems." Friedrich Bauer, the camp doctor who once envied American medicine, helped establish West Germany's first rural health cooperative. When asked what inspired him, he answered, "Electric lights in a prisoner's ward." By the 1950s, former POWs helped launch agricultural reforms, industrial safety standards, and local self-government programs, all drawn from what they had witnessed behind barbed wire. What had begun as captivity became apprenticeship. Even decades later, the memory remained luminous. In 1984, 40 years after D-Day, 50 former Camp Herne prisoners returned to Texas. They visited the empty field where the barracks once stood. The town welcomed them with flags and brass bands. Some laid wreaths at the American Legion Memorial. Others knelt in prayer. Fritz Zimmermann spoke for them all. "We came as believers in destiny and race. We leave as believers in reason and work. We learned that democracy's chaos is not weakness, it is rhythm. That mercy is not softness, it is strength." The moral of their captivity was larger than the war itself. Power built on fear consumes itself. Power built on systems multiplies. The Americans had proven that a nation's greatest weapon was not its army, but its ability to keep the lights on, everywhere, for everyone, even for enemies. In the long arithmetic of history, the Red Ball Express, the Liberty Ship, and the factory floor mattered more than any battlefield. The soldiers at Camp Herne had witnessed the end of the heroic age and the beginning of the logistical one. The war had destroyed nations, but it had also revealed a truth too simple for tyrants to understand. Prosperity is the ultimate propaganda. When the last prisoner boarded the train eastward, he looked out over the Texas horizon. The fields shimmered under the sun. Beyond them stretched highways, telephone lines, oil rigs, and distant cities, signs of a country that had turned production into peace. He whispered to himself, "They won because they built." The train began to move, steel wheels humming like turbines on polished rails. The sound of industry, of order, of something eternal. The floodlights dimmed behind him, leaving the camp in darkness for the first time in years. And in that darkness, one question lingered. If mercy could win a world war, what might it build next?